Hello, this is Mrs. Grosh. The topic of today's lecture is Mysteries of the Deep. The ocean is so deep and so dark that it's hard to know what's going on more than a few meters below its surface. But scientists do have some ways of learning what's going on in the deep part of the ocean. One thing that they know about is something we call bathymetry. Bathymetry is basically the shape of the ocean floor. Because the ocean floor is so far below the surface of the ocean, it's impossible for us to go down and explore it directly with our eyes. So instead, scientists have to use indirect observations. They use measurements and some observations they can make from the surface to figure out what they can't actually see directly. Scientists have been doing this for a long time. Back in the 1800s, scientists would do what we call soundings, which is where they would lower a chain with a weight on the end of it down from a ship down to the ocean floor. And by taking measurements of how far down the weight with the chain would go before it hit the bottom, they could figure out some things about how deep the ocean floor is and whether it was completely flat or whether it had hills and valleys and things just like the land does. Well, we've discovered that the ocean floor actually does have mountains, trenches, and other features that you'll label on the diagram in front of you. I have some pictures to show you that in just a few minutes, but let me also tell you that as our technology has improved, we've also gotten more and better information. Now, instead of using soundings with a chain and a weight, we use sonar, sending sound waves down to the ocean floor. We're essentially doing the same thing, but what we're measuring is how long it takes for those sound waves to bounce back to the ship. And because we know the speed of sound through water, we can figure out how far those sound waves had to go. That technique is called sonar. We can take some submersibles, which are little submarines, to go down pretty far in the ocean. That mostly tells us about the life in the ocean because even submersibles are not usually safe to travel all the way down to the bottom. For that, scientists are more likely to use remote operated vehicles, which we call ROVs, to discover what's on the ocean floor. Using this technology, we have a pretty good idea of what the ocean floor looks like. You'll notice that some of the pictures you see here are not actually photographs because they show things that are either too deep or too dark for us to get a good photographic image. So some of them are computer-generated images or just artist diagrams. These pictures together show you all of the different parts that are labeled on your diagram. Let me go through them with you. They're not all in the same order, so you'll have to listen carefully. Most of you probably realize that when you go to the beach and you're on the coast, you can wade out into the water, and at first the water isn't very deep. That's because the continent, the land, juts out and is just covered by a small amount of water. This area, which is considered part of the ocean floor, is the continental shelf. On your diagram, it's actually labeled with the letter F. Eventually that shelf will drop off and the water will get much deeper. The place where it drops off is a slope, and we call it the continental slope. On your picture, it's letter A. The other thing in the diagram that you see that I've been labeling is the abyssal plain. The abyssal plain is basically the flat, deep part of the ocean, and it makes up most of the ocean floor. In your picture, it's labeled with a C. In between A and C on your diagram, you see some little, looks like hills sticking up, and they should actually be sticking up out of the water above the surface. They are what we call volcanic islands, and on your picture, they're labeled with a B. Because they stick up out of the ocean water, you can get an actual photograph of volcanic islands as you see here. As you might imagine, volcanic islands are formed when volcanoes erupt, and those volcanoes are under the water. If they stay under the water, we call them seamounts, and the one in your diagram is letter E. Two more features that you'll notice on your diagram. One is right in the center, and it's the mid-ocean ridge. Maybe you remember the mid-ocean ridge from when we studied plate tectonics. It's really like a chain of mountains that forms when you have two tectonic plates spreading apart. On your diagram, that's letter D. And finally, the deepest parts of the ocean are actually ocean trenches. They're also caused by movement of tectonic plates. On your diagram, the label for the trench is G. Now that you know some things about what the ocean floor looks like, let's talk about life in the ocean. There's three main categories of ocean life. The first is plankton. Plankton are microscopic. They're either plants or animals, and they float on the surface of the water. They're very important because they are the sort of the foundation of the food chain for all other forms of ocean life. Most of the animals that you think about as being ocean animals are probably fish and other animals that swim. Their name for their category is nekton. And the third category for animals that live in the ocean are benthos. These are animals that stay at the bottom of the ocean. They live on the ocean floor. The type of life that you see depends on where you are in the ocean. If you look at the diagram on your page, you'll notice that first we divide the ocean into two zones. The neritic zone, which is really the shallow water that you find over the continental shelf, and then the pelagic zone, which is the deep water area over the rest of the ocean once the continental shelf drops off. We're going to talk now mostly about the different ocean zones in the pelagic part of the ocean. Scientists divide the ocean into four main areas, mostly depending on how much sunlight is in them. Now, they do have scientific names, but I'm just going to ask you to learn the more common names of these zones. The top one is called the sunlit zone, and it goes from the very surface of the water down to about 200 meters deep. Below there you have the twilight zone, which goes from 200 to about 1,000 meters deep, followed by the midnight zone, which is from 1,000 to maybe 3,000 meters deep. And finally, you have the abyssal zone, which is anything below 3,000 meters all the way down to the ocean floor. The final depth of the abyssal zone really depends on how far down the ocean floor is at any particular point that you're up studying. Here's some things you should know about the different ocean zones and the animals and plants that live there. You're not going to have enough room on your paper to write everything word for word, so just think about what the most important facts are, unless you want to use your own paper to add to what you already have space to write. The sunlit zone is where about 90% of all ocean life can be found. All plants live in this area, as do many different kinds of swimming animals, tuna, sharks, dolphins. This is the place where photosynthesis can happen. Once you get below this zone, it's really too dark for photosynthesis to occur. That's why the next zone, the twilight zone, doesn't have any plants in it. It's much too dark for the plants to survive. That also means there's no photosynthesis here, so any oxygen that's in the water was produced up above it. Fish that live in this area generally have very efficient gills, and they might include swordfish, squid, cuttlefish. Some of the animals that live in this zone actually rise to the top, to the sunlit zone at night, so that they can feed on the plankton that lives there. The midnight zone has some really fascinating looking animals, but it would be a terrible place to visit. It's completely dark and freezing cold. It's got very, very high water pressure, so animals that live here really can't survive at the upper depths because their bodies are designed to live in these areas of very high pressure. A lot of the animals that live here make their own light, so we call them bioluminescent. There are no plant eaters down here because there's no plants for them to eat. So they either prey on other animals or they're scavengers. They eat the dead things that eventually sink down from the areas above them. Finally, we have the abyssal zone. The animals that live here are benthos. They're animals that live on the ocean floor. Some of them scavenge the remains of dead animals from upper zones in the ocean, but also many of them can use energy from hydrothermal vents to help them produce their food. This is a very unusual set of animals, and I'd like you to learn more about them. So, as you can see on the back of your lecture notes, you have a set of research questions that you'll need to use some websites to find out about the different animals that live in the near the hydrothermal vents on the ocean floor. And that's the end of this lecture. I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks for listening. I'll see you in class tomorrow.